I think the explanation is straightforward. The neocons are not interested in strategic balance or strategic stability. They're interested in global hegemony. They adopt and pursue the idea that the United States is, should be, and can remain the world's sole superpower. This is absurd in substance, because the United States is not, cannot, and should not be the world's sole superpower. The United States is 4.2% of the world population. It should do its share. It should be responsible. It should promote strategic balance, not hegemony, or what some in the U.S. security state call full spectrum dominance. The neocons are not interested in balance. They are therefore actually undermining balance wherever it is. The whole reason for the war in Ukraine is the United States could not accept a mutually respectful peace with Russia. The United States had to keep moving NATO eastward to surround Russia. The United States does not accept a mutually respectful relationship with China. The United States wants to surround China with its military bases and military alliances. This is why the situation is so destabilizing, because the United States is not, and by the United States, by the way, I don't mean the U.S. people. I mean the security state, which is dominated by this arrogance of unipolarity. They're not seeking stability. They're seeking dominance. And seeking dominance is not only, I think, immoral, but utterly impracticable, because the United States is not dominant. It is one of many powerful countries in the world, but there are many major powers in the world, and the United States seems intent to take them on. It won't succeed, but it will leave bloodshed, massive bloodshed, in the places that are trapped between the superpower fights, and Ukraine is the latest victim. It was a victim that was talked into its role by promises by the United States that we'll defeat Russia together. Of course, in the end, Russia is not defeated, but Ukraine is reduced to rubble. And this is unfortunately the American tendency.
Now, where do you think leaves us this insight, like for neutrality and non-alignment, especially for countries that are really kind of trying to be non-aligned, not this kind of lapdog neutrality that Austria and Switzerland and Ireland are going, because they have already been captured pretty much by the ideology, by the same ideology. But those states in Africa, South America, and India and Southeast Asia that don't want to go along, I mean, this puts a target on them as well, right? The United States will see any kind of third-party policy as inherently antagonistic. I mean, these neocons, the Victoria Nuland types.
Well, I think that from a strategic point of view, each region needs to get together so it's not picking off one country at a time, but actually regions cooperating. So I strongly advocate that ASEAN work together as a group. I advocate that the South American countries, indeed, it would be good if the Latin American and Caribbean countries, but at least the regions, work together as a group. The United States approach is divide and conquer, the old strategy that dates back 2,000 years to the Roman Empire. So it picks off Venezuela, and then it divides Latin America between those who are on the U.S. side against Venezuela and those who are on the Venezuelan side. But what, of course, is the right response for Latin America is don't be divided that way. If you are divided that way, everybody loses. Millions of refugees from Venezuela that came from a brutal and premeditated attempt by the United States to overthrow the Maduro government. And who pays the consequences? All of the region, of course, Venezuela first in a shocking collapse of the economy and social life, but Colombia and other neighboring countries that have become home to millions of refugees from Venezuela. So I'm extremely happy, although it's very difficult, that Lula is back in the presidency in Brazil, because Lula can bring together the Latin American governments to say to the United States also, look, we're not your enemy, but stop dividing us. Stop trying to overthrow governments in our region, because we don't want that. And that really needs to be the response everywhere. The United States traps countries in proxy wars, and those countries lose. I tried to tell my Ukrainian counterparts, they were at that time my Ukrainian friends, then they stopped listening to me and wanting to repudiate what I was saying, but I kept warning them, you are going to get trapped by the United States. And this is exactly what has happened.
Do you have any more hope for Taiwan? Because it seems to me the US is trying to do exactly the same now, with preparing Taiwan to be an unsinkable aircraft carrier and then have bloodshed without end on Taiwan in order to fight a proxy war with China.
I was just in Taiwan. I was given a wonderful award called the Tang Prize by a fantastic foundation. I spoke to a major Buddhist foundation in Taiwan, the Tzu Chi Foundation. And what a wonderful society, what a successful place. And I gave the warning everywhere that I could, don't get trapped into this U.S. PRC fight, because this would be devastating. The United States basically is led by a lot of ignoramuses. I happen to know a lot of them. They're very poorly educated. They're educated in a kind of American arrogance. They are outdated by 30 years, thinking that the world is just at the U.S. Doorstep, or that the U.S. has the prerogatives, I should say better, anywhere in the world. They don't know what they're doing. And I tried to say to Taiwanese leaders, be careful, because this is really what happened in Ukraine. Now, the U.S. approach is so mind-bogglingly wrong-headed. It says the way to protect a country is to arm it. Well, this is the fallacy that my late and great colleague at Columbia University, Robert Jervis, wrote about for decades, what he called the security dilemma. The United States may look at arming a country as a, quote, defensive action, but from the point of view of the country on the other side of that arming, that looks like a pretty aggressive action, and it therefore triggers a response. It triggers a retaliation. It makes conflict more likely. So the United States poured arms into Ukraine after 2014. It thought it was going to make peace that way. Well, yeah, maybe some of these dunderheads in Washington believed that, but of course it was leading towards conflict. And the idea that the way to protect Taiwan is by making Taiwan what they call in Washington a porcupine, so armed that it won't be touched, with all those quills protecting it. This is absurd. The arms shipments would only make Taiwan more and more endangered, more and more at risk. The way to reduce, even eliminate these risks is diplomacy. Diplomacy between the United States and China, diplomacy between Taiwanese leaders and mainland Chinese leaders. Talk with each other. For heaven's sake, there is an absolute vital interest on both sides of the Taiwan Straits for peace. There really is. And if the United States would just get out of the way for a moment and the two sides could talk with each other, they'd actually find a way forward. But the United States comes in with its naive and destabilizing promises. We'll keep you safe. Yeah, they'll keep Taiwan safe like they kept Afghanistan safe, like they kept South Korea safe, like they kept Ukraine safe. In other words, not at all. And how many failures do these neocons, how many failures are they going to have before they are finally taken off the pedestal of power? By the way, it's not that the American people believe any of this. It's just that we don't have a functioning representative government. Our foreign policy has been taken in the hands of Raytheon and General Dynamics and these neocons. The American people are asked nothing about this. So this is not a reflection of the martial spirit of the American people, although our mainstream media feed a lot of absolute falsehoods to the American people. But it is the fact that foreign policy is in the hands of the security state, that is governed economically by the military-industrial complex, which funds the major committees in Congress, which provide the votes and the money for a $1 trillion plus annual military outlay. And that's where we are right now. It's absolutely awful. In the United States, foreign policy is the small preserve of the military-industrial complex.
I share that analysis with you. The oxymoron to me is that the United States keeps talking about itself. So, and I apologize again, the same people that you're talking about keep talking about the United States as a force for good and a force for peace, when in reality, the United States is highly militarized, highly militaristic, and reacts to conflict always with military components. That surprises me.
Well, I would add, I think since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been the most militarized and most violent country in the world. And this is just a matter of record. One recent scholarly account, a very good one, counted 70 U.S.-led regime change operations between 1947 and 1989. So the study was over the Cold War period. And just in that period, 1947 to 1989, 70 regime change operations, 6 of which were overt wars to overthrow a foreign government, and 64 were covert operations. Now, this is stunning. First of all, covert operations don't remain covert. It's pretty obvious if you're a reader of the New York Times, which wants you to suck your thumb and go to sleep. But if you're a thinker who's looking at the actual evidence, pretty clear when the U.S. is covertly overthrowing another government like it tried to do in Syria. Now, the point is that this is the normal U.S. modus operandi: war, coups, and overthrows. And after 1989, the big change wasn't that the United States stopped that behavior. The big change was the United States thought it could get away with anything, whether in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in 2011. Obama and Hillary, well, they decided, okay, we're going to overthrow Assad. That was just a conscious decision. And 12 years later, they left that country in shambles because they're fools. What do they think? That they can dictate? By the way, they said, both Obama and Trump, okay, we're going to overthrow Maduro. We'll do it through economic sanctions. They crushed the economy. And as stupid as they are in Washington, they said, okay, we'll now pretend that Maduro's not the president. We'll just name another president from outside, Juan Guaido. And you have to think, is this a cartoon? Is this a fairy tale? Are these idiots that they think that from Washington they can name the president of Venezuela, but they actually tried to do this for several years. And I have friends in, well, they wouldn't call me friends, but in academia in the East Coast in the US that said, okay, I'm going to work for the new Guaido government. I said, Guaido government, because the US names him as president, he's suddenly president, you're going to work for him? Come on. So this is a deep and continuing tendency. The United States, it seems to me, forgot any kind of diplomacy. Diplomacy means you sit down and you negotiate mutual concerns. And by the way, to be successful, you show respect to the other side. And you try to listen to the concerns of the other side so that you can find a durable solution. That whole approach has completely gone. They don't even know how to negotiate. They have no interest in negotiating. They don't talk about it. This is amazing to me.
And there is actually a new study that shows that the rate of foreign intervention of the United States picked up after 1989 and didn't slow down. So the idea that the end of the Cold War would reduce interventions is actually wrong. This can be shown now. And one last question to you. Reconciliation with Russia. You wrote recently a wonderful piece on your homepage about how Kennedy would have made peace, and I mean John F. Kennedy. And in that piece, though, supposes two things. One, Kennedy supposed that the US and USSR were equals, and two, he supposed that both states wanted to make peace. Now, it strikes me that both of these assumptions are not true anymore. Or do you think the US thinks of Russia as an equal and as somebody that they want peace with, unless it is with Russia in broken up?
Well, the neocons had a plan to try to either overthrow Putin or to so-called decolonize Russia. It's a vulgar thing. They didn't want to deal with Russia as a counterpart country for negotiations. On December 17, 2021, President Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement. This was the last off-ramp to avoid the Ukraine escalation in 2022. I urge the White House, talk now. Based on that document, there's a lot in there that's absolutely valid. Most importantly, stop the NATO enlargement to Ukraine, which has no sense and which is a Russian red line for completely understandable reasons. No, we don't talk to any third party about NATO, is the U.S. refrain. That means we don't negotiate, we don't understand diplomacy, we don't recognize Russia's legitimate security concerns. And you end up with wars this way. Now, I continue to believe to this moment that if Biden said the words, we will recognize Russia's legitimate security concerns in a legitimate peace agreement that also respects Ukraine's sovereignty, that respects America's security interests and Russia's security interests, we could actually get to a negotiated peace. And pretty quickly, it would be based on Ukraine as a neutral country. A fact that Zelensky himself noted in a brief moment in 2022 until the United States told him to stop noting that and demanded that Ukraine shut down the negotiations. So Zelensky actually came back to what had been the basis of Ukraine's independence, the basis of its constitution, and the basis of an effective foreign policy for Ukraine neutrality. He came back to that. The United States tried to shut it down. Well, of course, the U.S. policy is failing badly, not for the first time, for continuously failing, because this is American foreign policy, but it's destroying Ukraine in the process. Can the two sides, U.S. and Russia, actually still end this through negotiations, this war? Of course they could, even today. I keep saying, to Biden, if you want to talk, I'll give you my Zoom link. You can make a Zoom link with Putin. Go ahead. You want to borrow my cell phone? Call him. Start negotiations. They're basically cowards in the U.S. In the sense that they won't negotiate, because Kennedy put it right. He said, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. And they're afraid of negotiating in Washington, or they just forgot what it even means. So they don't have diplomats. I don't know what it is, but I've never seen anything like this. The absence of trying to find the way out of this disaster. And they need to open negotiations now.
Actually, the first lie came when the Soviet Union shot down a CIA spy plane, the U-2 spy plane with Gary Powers, just on the eve of what was supposed to be a summit between Eisenhower and Soviet Party Chairman Nikita Khrushchev. And the CIA lies for a living. We know this. But it lied to the President of the United States also, saying, Mr. President, don't worry, they can't shoot down the spy plane. It's too high. And if they do shoot down the spy plane, it's designed to disintegrate. And if it doesn't disintegrate anyway, the pilot is going to take his cyanide pill. There's no way anything can happen to embarrass you. And of course, they shoot down the spy plane. They get the wreckage. They get the pilot alive, Gary Powers. They don't announce that. They say we have been spied upon and downed a plane without revealing those details. And Eisenhower comes out and says, no, this is a weather craft that went off course from Turkey. And then the Soviets reveal, we have the fuselage, we have the pilot who has told us about his spy mission, direct, blatant lies. Then soon after this comes the direct, blatant lies of the Bay of Pigs. It's dangerous. And this is the CIA, by the way, and it's the CIA till today, in my view. It is lying and unaccountable and really never called to task for these lies because the public doesn't know them, doesn't understand what's going on. But from the Soviet U.S. point of view, within months of the Kennedy administration, this air was poisoned. And there was one other thing that was absolutely precipitating all of this, which was, and very fundamental and completely never discussed in America almost at all, but there had been no peace treaty at the end of World War II. And the Cold War emerged, in fact, over a bitter dispute between the Soviet Union and the United States about the future of Germany. The Soviet Union had lost more than 20 million people in the war and did not want to see German remilitarized. The United States, on the other hand, decided that the three occupied regions from the western side, the U.S., French, and British regions, would form a single new Federal Republic of Germany. The remaining fourth part, the Soviet-occupied part, would become the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. But the western side would become the bulwark of a new military alliance, NATO, and it would be remilitarized. And the Soviet Union said, no, we just lost more than 20 million people. Now, within a few years, you're remilitarizing. Well, of course, the United States never listened, never negotiated, and at the end of the 1950s, took another step. Eisenhower was flirting with the idea, maybe we should just give our allies control over nuclear weapons as well, so we can reduce the U.S. Troops numbers in Europe. Eisenhower was very frugal. He was a fiscal conservative, and he wanted to bring troops home and use the nuclear shield. And so there was, at the end of the 1950s, lots of talk about nuclear sharing. And this was freaking out the Soviet Union also. And the United States doesn't know how to talk to anybody. There's no diplomacy. There are mortal enemies. There's no one to negotiate. And so the situation by the time Kennedy came in was completely fraught. Then came the Bay of Pigs. Then Khrushchev said, okay, we need to teach Americans a bit of their own lessons. We'll put missiles in Cuba. And Khrushchev had a quite remarkable exchange with Andrei Gromyko, as foreign minister. Gromyko said, no, what, war? And Khrushchev said, no, not war, just basically teach these Americans about their arrogance. They have missiles in Turkey. We're going to put missiles in Cuba. Nothing about war. But of course, everything immediately spiraled out of control when the missile placements were discovered and the subterfuge that the Soviets were using to place the missile systems in place. And it was like the subterfuge of the United States doing what it did on its side. Things get out of hand. And as soon as Kennedy saw the U-2 spy plane over Cuba taking these pictures of missile sites, he convened an executive committee, ExComm, and it was almost unanimous. Well, we got to shoot down these sites. We have to take them out before they can be deployed. And it was unanimous, essentially, that there needed to be an immediate war, and the Joint Chiefs were told to go off and plan the military campaign against Cuba. Would it be an air campaign? Would it just be to take out the sites? How many troops would be needed, and so forth? Kennedy, interestingly, to make a very long story short, had lunch by coincidence with Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, on the first day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy had seen the pictures. And Adlai Stevenson said to Kennedy, well, of course you need diplomacy to end this, and, exchange the missiles with the Turkish missiles. Kennedy was shocked because no other advisor had said anything about diplomacy. It was basically unanimous for a military approach, which, by the way, almost surely may be too strong, although I'm not sure it is, but most likely would have led to nuclear annihilation, because our doctrine was that if we were attacked by a nuclear weapon, we would give a full response. By the way, full meaning not only the Soviet Union, but Eastern and Central Europe, China, hundreds of millions of people killed. And now we learned afterwards from the nuclear winter, maybe all of humanity perishing from starvation afterwards. But Stevenson laid the idea of maybe a negotiated settlement. Well, to make a long story short, as people know, Kennedy really almost alone, though with this hint from Stevenson, and then with his brother Robert pushing, and Ted Sorensen pushing, and a few others pushing, turned the tide over a few days that don't do something precipitous. Let's try to figure out what's in Khrushchev's mind. And Kennedy came to realize, because he had people like the Air Force head, Curtis LeMay, who just wanted nuclear war, it seems, or a first strike against the Soviet Union, that he was surrounded by a lot of hotheads who could end the world. And he realized Khrushchev probably was as well. And the two of them came to realize we better tamp this down. And they did. And they agreed on a deal of this removal of missiles, both from Cuba and from Turkey. The big mistake Kennedy made, and I always think it's unfair to call it a mistake because he saved the world, so you get a lot of credit for that. But the mistake he made was insisting that the deal be secret, so that it looked to the American people like he had simply faced down the Soviet Union and they had backed away, because it wasn't known that the removal of the American missiles were part of an exchange. And that wasn't known for decades, actually.
So let's talk about how Kennedy changed and what he set out to do. And of course, it was all cut short by his assassination in November of 1963.
I think first it's fair to say that being president of the United States is a tough job. and it's impossible to do right in the early days and early years because you don't get it. And our security state in the United States, which was created by the National Security Act of 1947, which created a secret security state and a private army of the United States called the CIA, which is one half its function because it does intelligence and it does private warfare of the United States. And the whole apparatus is secret and largely out of control. And it is absolutely out of control by any public understanding or scrutiny or accountability or congressional oversight today as it was in the early 1960s. Well, Kennedy came in with a lot of energy and idealism and brilliance, and he stumbled terribly in the first year with the Bay of Pigs, Cuban invasion, and then in the second year, the near disaster of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And my view is he had the potential for greatness at the beginning, and by his third year, he had become a magnificent politician and statesman of the first order, one of our truly great presidents. Not so much in the first 2 years, although the potential was there, but the growth that came through this set of trials was extraordinary. Already after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy was so disturbed by the CIA that he was beside himself about how they had led the U.S. and his administration and himself personally into this awful debacle. He didn't trust the CIA. After the Cuban Missile Crisis and after hearing people like Curtis LeMay even essentially calling Kennedy a traitor for not launching the war or a coward, and feeling all of this pressure for war, he was profoundly disturbed and profoundly moved and profoundly scared at how fragile the world was. And he was determined to do something in 1963. And
let me just interject. He fired Dulles and he fired Bissell. So he actually took on the CIA establishment and triggered deep animus. And I want you, as you go on, to talk about this speech. But one of the things I found fascinating from your book is how few people he informed about what it was he was about to say. And so I want to make sure we talk about the content of what he said.
So Kennedy wanted to say to the American people, peace is possible, even with the Soviet Union, even with the other side. And the whole content of the speech is they are human beings like we are. They want to live. They want to protect their children. They want to have a future. And this speech is unbelievable because it's the only foreign policy speech I know of anywhere where it is not telling the other side what to do, not making threats, not reveling in glory, not saying we are number one, not saying they are evil, but saying to the American people, we need to reconsider our own position. And remember, today we're told every day by the completely irresponsible, reckless, and ignorant mass media like the New York Times, I'm going to say, because it's terrible, and like the Washington Post and others, there's no one to talk to. There's no one to negotiate with over Ukraine. And in the Cold War in 1963, it was even more like that. The Cuban Missile Crisis had just occurred. Could you even imagine negotiating with the Soviet Union? And Kennedy's whole message is, we can negotiate. They want the same things. They too will abide by treaties as long as those treaties are also in their interest. And they can be relied upon to abide by treaties that are in their interest and also in our interest. There is a benefit of cooperation. This is rational. In fact, the pursuit of peace is the rational end of rational men, says President Kennedy.
I just want to read a couple sections because it is an absolutely remarkable, and as you point out through Sorensen, beautifully elegiac and just gorgeously written. But these are some of the things. I want to read three short sections. I speak of peace, this is Kennedy, as the necessary rational end of rational men. I realize that the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war. And frequently the words of the pursuer fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. And then he says, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. And just to conclude, he asks in the speech, what kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children, not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women, not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. I mean, this is incredible.
It gives you goosebumps. Of course, I've listened, I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of times to the speech. I've made my family listen on so many occasions. But the words are thrilling. The words are mesmerizing in their beauty, and Ted Sorensen has a big hand in that as well. And in their ability to make change. And I think one of the things that Kennedy also says in here, which is incredible, is his advice on leadership. And I don't have exactly the words here, but to paraphrase, he says, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So the goal of peace, if made to be manageable, practical, like a treaty to stop atomic testing stop atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, is a practical, manageable step, and people draw hope from it. So the speech was so riveting and powerful. By the way, kept completely outside of the bureaucracy. It was essentially hidden from the security apparatus, from the State Department, the CIA, even the White House. Only Sorensen and Kennedy worked on it basically until the last moment. Then they said, I'm giving this. Kennedy said, I'm giving it. So it could not be vetoed by state or by the Defense Department or the National Security Council or anybody else. And he gave it. And what is amazing, absolutely amazing, is that Khrushchev heard it, was carried away, summoned the U.S. envoy, Kennedy's envoy to Moscow, Averell Harriman, and said, this is the finest speech by an American president since FDR. I want to make peace with your president. The words were so powerful. The motivation, the ideas were so powerful. Kennedy disseminated the speech through Pravda, Izvestia, online.
Isn't that hilarious? Pravda reprinted it.
Exactly, and broadcast the speech. And within a few weeks, they had signed the agreement. Within a few weeks. Absolutely an astounding achievement. Then Kennedy, just to say, he was also the grassroots politician. He was a political guy to the core. He went out to campaign for it. And so he took his tour around the United States. The Joint Chiefs, oh, well, we don't know. They come to testify in Congress and try to knock down this agreement. And Kennedy carried the American public overwhelmingly, and then won a decisive victory in the Senate 60 years ago, just now, for the ratification of this treaty. And this is the time when we're talking is the time of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy went to tell the leaders what this meant in another completely magnificent address. And he said, this is not the end of conflict, but it is a ray of hope piercing through the clouds. And he ends his address to the world leaders assembled in front of him in the chamber of the UN General Assembly. Kennedy, having brought peace, brought hope, and all the world leaders assembled in front of him. And he says to them that Archimedes is said to have told his friends, "Give me a place to stand and I can move the world." Fellow leaders of the world, let us see if we can take our stand here in this place, in this time, to move the world towards peace. And you just can't get better than that. The idealism, the hope, the practicality, and Kennedy infused the whole world with it. And then they killed him.
And we've lost it. We've lost it.
And they killed him because I'm personally convinced, after having studied this in depth for decades now, and now we have the report completely debunking the Warren Commission with the magic bullet being no magic bullet at all, but a bullet that the Secret Service pulled out of the back of Kennedy's seat and put on the stretcher, debunking the entire forensic basis of the Warren Commission. I'm pretty convinced that it was rogue elements within the U.S. government itself.
Well, Alan Dulles.
Alan Dulles,
Can't
CIA.
get more evil. Can't get more evil than that.
Exactly. We don't know exactly who, but this was a conspiracy, and it was a conspiracy against peace. And it's our security state is in full force. Our president, in my view, is not in control, and in any event has been a hardliner and a Cold Warrior, whatever you want to call it, well past the Cold War. These neocons don't understand peace. They don't understand negotiation. They don't understand diplomacy. They don't understand the nuclear threat. And one other point, Chris, of the speech that I think is so pertinent and completely neglected, Kennedy says, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world. And the U.S. has gone out to humiliate Putin and to defeat Putin. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear weapons. What are we doing? What are we thinking? Of course, I take it a little bit, even a step back. I think this is, I call it the war of NATO enlargement, because I think the entire war in Ukraine came because the United States so recklessly and imprudently kept pushing NATO enlargement. Russia saying, stop. It's a red line. Stop. And then not to Ukraine, for heaven's sake, not to Ukraine, our 2,300 kilometer border, not to surround us in the Black Sea. And the U.S. is deaf to this. And then trying to humiliate Putin and doing exactly the opposite of what Kennedy said. And I take it seriously when Kennedy says in that remark about not pushing a nuclear power to a corner, he says, above all, as if that's the synthesis of what he's learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Above all, don't humiliate a nuclear adversary. And our people don't even know it. We don't have diplomats, and we don't have a president, in my view, that understands the job of keeping the foot on the brake. So it's a very dangerous time.
Putin is an extremely dangerous guy, and his regime follows a historical pattern in Russia, which is the impotence and incapacity of reforming the country. It gets more and more autocratic, and at the end, they are waging war. And this narrative that Putin is this highly dangerous guy who puts the opposition in prison. He is an aggressive dictator. It's an all-pervading view, even in reasonable circles in Switzerland. For example, if you talk to entrepreneurs, to people who have traveled the world, for them, just emotionally, this Putin is such a dangerous guy that they sympathize emotionally with this American containment policy or NATO enlargement policy. What would you say to these people who say, well, Professor Sachs, I mean, he's locking up the opposition. He's an autocrat. He has become a dictator. It's a terrible regime. We have to stop this man.
Well, I think it is a relatively authoritarian regime, but that doesn't mean that it is one that is out to make war in its neighborhood. It's Russia that was invaded by the West so many times and by all these wonderful democracies. So this idea that, Russia's authoritarian and therefore militaristic and we're democracies and therefore is peaceful is preposterous. The most violent country in the world in the 19th century by far was Britain, the most democratic, but it used its internal democracy to cheerlead building a global empire. The United States has been engaged in more wars than any other country since 1950. We're a democracy, but we're completely violent in overthrowing dozens of governments, in launching wars of choice all over the world, in having 800 military bases overseas. So it's simple-minded to say, oh, well, that's just a Russian tradition. Yeah, Russian tradition is to have been invaded by Napoleon. Russian tradition has been to have been invaded by Britain and France in the First Crimean War, which is, by the way, was fought on exactly the same principles as this war is fought, because the idea of Palmerston was blockade Russia in the Black Sea, destroy its military capacity, naval capacity in the Black Sea, surround Russia in the Black Sea, and Russia doesn't threaten our empire. That was Palmerston's idea, very clear. Basically, he was the great imperialist of his age. And he just wanted to go on, by the way, after the fall of Sevastopol in 1856, he wanted to go on to the Caucasus, just like expanding NATO to Georgia, by the way. Same model. Brzezinski just took the Palmerston model because geography doesn't change. And Russia was invaded by Hitler and suffered more loss than any other place on the planet. And then, this is a long story, but the United States after World War II, instead of negotiating a peace arrangement with the Soviet Union, unilaterally decided to remilitarize Germany, excuse me. And Kennan was absolutely against this policy. Kennan said, just like Austria is neutral, if Germany is neutral, the Cold War can end. But the United States didn't want it that way. So all of this phony history and this about Russia's military history and so forth. Russia's a country that was constantly invaded from the outside, mostly from the West, but of course, during the Golden Horde from the East, from the Mongols. And the issue for Russia in the mindset of the state leaders of Russia is we are threatened at our borders, period. And so that's why Ukrainian neutrality is really a good idea. Because if you really want the history is Russia is always looking for safe space because it's always worried about outside invasion coming in. And now with respect to Putin, the truth is, even with all of the bad behavior of the United States in the 1990s, Putin came in as a friend of Europe and the United States. And anyone that knows anything about the early years of the 2000s knows that to be true, and I know it firsthand. And I know many European leaders that had absolutely good, fruitful relations with Putin. And I've spoken.
Have you met President Putin? Also?
Of course, yes.
What's your impression? What's your personal? I mean, you met Gorbachev. You met Yeltsin.
Yeah, I really loved Gorbachev. I wouldn't say the same about Putin, but I don't know him. But Gorbachev I loved because he was really a man of peace. And Yeltsin I liked. I wish he had stayed sober more often. It would have really helped the world. But he wanted normalcy, and I wanted to help him get that. And the United States just could not take yes for an answer on either case. The United States attitude was, they're on the other side. We're the sole superpower. We beat them. We can do what we want. That's the arrogance that has gotten us into this complete mess. And all these claims about Putin being intrinsically dangerous, European leaders absolutely can tell they were working with him fruitfully for many, many years. And Europeans cheated repeatedly. Where's the Minsk II agreements? Even Merkel says so. I mean, it's shocking what she said. I don't even believe it in the way she said it. It was so garish. But in any event,
this quote in Die Zeit where she said,
"Yeah, I think it's
we just wanted to buy time to."
Yeah, I think it was taken a little bit out of context because she's not so cynical, actually, from all my experience. But the idea that Putin's all bad and we're all wonderful, that's our narrative every day. That's so deadly, mainly for Ukraine, because it's so phony.
I was in Moscow a few months ago. I talked to a lot of people, and I had some interesting conversations. And one eminent scholar told me, Putin has been too trustful of the West for too long. He was a westernized leader, and that was this man, I criticized Putin all the time for not being enough pro-Russia. He was too much pro-West. Is that an impression you have, that Putin was really a guy who put his hopes into the trustworthiness of the West?
Well, I think Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin all did that. And this is a question for, Gorbachev and NATO enlargement. There's no question that Gorbachev was told over and over again by James Baker, by Hans-Dietrich Genscher, by the Secretary General of NATO, we won't move 1 inch. We will never take advantage of you. And then he didn't put it in writing. He really didn't put it in writing, but there's a huge amount in writing in the Western archival material about all the promises that were made, and they were all blown off immediately. So the West was really untrustworthy. And then in 1999, NATO bombed Serbia on a ruse, because it is a ruse. And if you really go to the deep story of the bombing and the internal competition between Madeleine Albright and Richard Holbrooke about who was going to be Secretary of State in the next administration, who could be tougher. Oh, it's unbelievable. We bombed Serbia for weeks. And that was a little bit of a downer, but even then, Putin stayed with us. Then in 2002, the United States unilaterally walked away from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Even then, Putin stayed with us. I think the final blow was basically 2008, this NATO business in the Bucharest summit. I think that was really the end of of any trust. But he went ahead with with Minsk, and I think he believed that the Normandy process of Germany and France would stand up and actually do something. And we know that behind the scenes, the Minsk agreement was completely blown off by all of the powers that be. So I think that there are a lot of Russians who just view this completely the opposite of the way that we are fed in the Western media. I don't think you have to view it all one way or all another way, but you do have to step back and understand the history of this. And the most fundamental point I would make is Ukraine should be neutral, should have remained neutral, should have, and we should have listened to a valid Russian red line. And I will emphasize both red line and a valid one. We would never tolerate Mexico joining a military alliance with China or Russia, no matter what open door, what principles, never. And it's perfectly understandable that Russia also would not tolerate this. And by the way, again, just to beat what should be obvious to completion, Bill Burns, who is a very intelligent person and now our CIA director,
ambassador in Moscow.
In 2008, he wrote the clearest possible memo. Niet means niet. Don't do this NATO enlargement. It's not just Putin, it's the entire Russian political class. Everybody objects to it. The academics, the scholars, the scientists, the politicians, the pro-Putin side, the anti-Putin side. Everybody is against this. And as typical for the U.S., first of all, the memo was secret, so the American people were never told anything. Second, it was only revealed by Assange, by WikiLeaks. So that's why we have to lock up Assange, because he told Americans the truth. Third, even when it's there now for everyone to read, because you can just go Google it and read it, the New York Times wouldn't dream of mentioning it in all of the commentary about this war since 2014, much less since 2021.
Amazing. Going back to the war, how big is the chance of a nuclear escalation or some other forms of escalation? For example, if the Ukrainian forces would really crumble, would NATO, would the Americans just stand by and let Putin win this war? And on the other hand, do you see any perspective of tactical nuclear weapons, deployment by the Russians? How is the escalation danger of this war at the moment?
When Obama talked about escalatory dominance of Russia, he meant that if Russia were imperiled, it would escalate to nuclear war. I believe that to be true. And it's been said countless times now by Medvedev, by other Russian leaders, in not so hidden terms by Putin, and so on. If Russia were deeply endangered, it would escalate, and up to and including nuclear weapons used in Ukraine. If Russia were to lose Crimea or to be threatened to be overrun in Crimea, which is the direct war aim right now of Ukraine, probably not achievable, and its infeasibility probably keeps the world alive, because if it were feasible, or if the United States and UK somehow made it feasible through NATO jets directly flying missions to support Ukrainian infantry, something that's not unthinkable, there would be a real chance of nuclear escalation. This is clear. The barrier between non-nuclear and nuclear is not very bright, is not a very bright line. History has told us repeatedly. We have come close to nuclear war on several occasions, and there are generals in the U.S. who believe in using nuclear war. We don't have a no first strike policy. And Russia is on tenterhooks about the possibility of being attacked. So terrible accidents can happen, miscalculations can happen, or massive failures on one side or another can happen. And right now, it seems less likely that it would be a result of a collapse of the Russian military that would lead to this. You raise a very good question. What if Ukraine were to collapse on the other side, which is a real possibility? What would the West do? And by the West, all we mean ever is the U.S. security establishment, because there is no other independent voice except the UK standing and cheerleading whatever the U.S. says, do 10 times more, because they still love their empire. But that would be a real question. And my answer to that would be that I would hope that Russia would have some forbearance and know to stop before provoking something extraordinarily dangerous, because then it would be in Russia's hands. And there's a wonderful quote, which I'm just looking up right now, a famous line from Kennedy's famous peace speech on June 10, 1963. He said, "Above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcies of our policies or of a collective death wish for the world." And I may have garbled a word or two. We can correct it in the, but the point is, what I find remarkable about that statement, and I've not only studied that speech relentlessly, but wrote a book about it, actually. Kennedy talks a lot about all the dangers, but he says above all, and when saying above all, he really means above all, avert those confrontations which put a nuclear power at the choice of a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. And we don't seem to understand that almost at all. Mm-hmm. Or there are enough cheerleaders that say, "Oh, it's a bluff. Don't worry about that. Don't be nuclear blackmail," and so on. Kennedy's telling us something extraordinarily important. He lived through the missile crisis. He and Khrushchev enabled the world to survive that crisis. And what he's telling us above all is avoid such confrontations. And the U.S. is incompetent in this right now, in that I'm told when I complain to senior politicians in Washington about the dangers, they tell me privately, no, Jeff, believe me, we're telling the Ukrainians, don't take back Crimea. That's not the U.S. goal, and so forth. That's what I hear, quote unquote, privately. But of course, the Ukrainian goal is we're going to take back every inch, including Crimea, and so on. So who's telling the truth in this? The answer is nobody knows, because it's all a large group of people, each playing their own game. It's extraordinarily dangerous what's going on. Could it escalate to nuclear war? Yeah, damn sure that it could, without question.
What is, just to nail it down, what is at the moment, in your eyes, what does Putin want? What is his primary objective, or what is his goal at the moment, if you would try to characterize that? What does he want now?
I think he wants Russian security. He wants to make sure that NATO never comes close to the border with Ukraine. He wants Biden to say that, so that this isn't, and to be part of a globally recognized commitment. And he wants to hold Crimea, for sure. And what's now, harder to assess is territorially, what about the rest? Because after, again, losing tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people, who knows, at what was not originally a territorial war, we don't know what we don't know what it is exactly right now. The Russians have just said again a couple of days ago that their aims are no NATO enlargement, holding the territories that they've annexed, which means the 4 regions together with Crimea, and denazification of the Ukrainian government, whatever specifically that means. What do I think is at the core of this? I think at the core of this is, as I keep saying, one is the Russian border and NATO. That, to my mind, is the most decisive element of all. Second is Crimea, which is never going back. And interestingly, and third is something about the rest of the territories. I don't think that Kherson and Zaporizhia are, profound issues for Russia, though they now have been annexed and so on. The Donbass is much more complicated. What was on the table a year ago was much better than what's on the table, what is easy to achieve in negotiations now. What was on the table in December 2017 would have kept Ukraine basically whole, except for Crimea, and peaceful. And that's what should have been accepted at that moment, because the agreement was there to be made. And that's when I begged the White House, negotiate now, because what Putin is saying is absolutely reasonable within our negotiating sphere.
What does President Biden want? What would you say is the primary goal of the United States government?
Right now, he wants to win re-election. I think that's the primary goal. The second goal is
losing face in the Ukraine.
Yeah. Let's put it this way. Obviously, Ukraine is not an existential issue for the United States. It's not even close to the issue that it is for Russia. So what does the United States really want? Biden, first of all, wants to win re-election. So many of our wars are paced by the political cycle. This is the most basic point. And just like the Vietnam War kept going on and on and on because there was always an election coming, this is the main point. Second, of course, Biden wants the United States to stand tall and lead the free world. So he doesn't, in principle, we got a lot of people in the U.S. political class who really believe, hell, no one can tell us what to do, where to go, where NATO should go. We don't have to listen to any of them. And then there's a group that really believes, I think it's almost a kind of madness, but I mean, it is a kind of madness. We got to stand tall in Ukraine because we have to send a strong signal to China. That's actually a group. That's actually a view by people who are chronologically grown-ups, although intellectually, I would say disgraceful, because the confusion on these issues is so unbelievably huge. But that's also another view. But what does Biden really want right now? He wants to get out of this without losing political support. That's what he really wants.
Well, I agree with all of it. Instead of the word obsessive, I would probably say relentless, because it has been the driver of U.S. foreign policy since 1992. The idea that there's a unipolar world, and now the U.S. is going to run everything with the demise of the Soviet Union. And so I think that this was really planned step by step, and it's all gone absolutely disastrously, because these people are not very clever, by the way. They really are not very clever. They have no sense of proportion and what they're doing. And of course, they denigrated Russia's capacity to respond to anything that the United States put up. So they got everything wrong relentlessly, but they have created exactly the formula to destroy Ukraine. This is the formula that says there's no path to peace, because the West will do exactly what Russia will fight to the end for, because it's an existential position for Russia, and that is not having NATO on its 2,000-kilometer border by being positioned in Ukraine. So this has been such a shit show. I don't know if we're allowed to say that on the air, but it's unbelievable. Trying to understand why is, I think it was basically a consistent underestimation of what Russia would do at every stage. So this was kind of the neocons, by their own bluster and blather and arrogance and ignorance, thinking that they could do whatever they wanted without any opposition, and President Putin called their bluff. And now they went to Vilnius without an idea in their heads about how to end this war. But what's stunning, what we're going to see, actually, since this is not going to be settled at the negotiating table in the coming weeks or months, this is obvious. The simple truth seems to be the one that Jake Sullivan and Biden said a few weeks ago, and that's the U.S. has run out of ammunition to give to Ukraine. And if that's the case, which is what the U.S. has said, well, it's just going to have an absolutely disastrous outcome for Ukraine. But Vilnius was without a single constructive idea, without any impulse whatsoever to actually help save Ukraine. They don't care. And I think another part of this, obviously, is that from the U.S. security establishment calculation, what does it matter how many more thousands or tens of thousands of people die? That's never been their calculation, as long as it's not U.S. body bags. And this is part of the profound cynicism of all of this. Not an idea, not a constructive approach, not a word about peace or negotiation or discussion, nothing except a formula guaranteed to be more disaster.
Absolutely. Can I just ask you one particular point which stood out for me about your article, which is something I didn't know, that in 1992, it seems that there were private discussions within the Bush administration about how to expand NATO eastwards. This is at the very time that, well, shortly after the time when the Russians were told that wasn't going to happen. It's also the time when people like yourself were preparing to go to Russia to work to find ways of changing Russia in some ways, integrating it with the West, building up the relationship between Russia and the West. And you've spoken on our programs about how you would telephone people in the White House and in the administrations, the various administrations, saying, can I get help to do this in Russia, which has worked in Poland? And it wasn't happening? Do you think there's a linkage with this?
Oh, no, it's the same story. It's not a linkage. It is exactly the same story. I didn't understand it at the time. I actually, got engaged heavily with Russia in 1990, with Soviet Union when Grigory Yavlinsky was the economic advisor to Gorbachev, and he asked me for help and some suggestions because what I had suggested for Poland, debt cancellation, emergency stabilization funding. I invented something called the Zloty Stabilization Fund, a currency stabilization fund. And just to give you an idea of what geopolitics was like, I know a lot about currency stabilization. That was my specialty. So I was helping Poland in its new government, the Mazowiecki government. And I had the idea literally one morning, it was the IMF meetings in September 1989. And I said, Poland needs a stabilization fund for its currency now that it's going to be making market reforms. And so I typed up a page of what a stabilization fund is from economic history. And I called Senator Robert Dole, who was the Senate Majority Leader. First, I called the Polish finance minister, who was in Washington in his first days ever as finance minister, and he was at the IMF meetings in Washington. And I said, Leszek, could I try to get you $1 billion today? And he said, oh, yeah, of course, if you can do that, fine. So I called up the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Dole, and I said, could I come in, Senator? And he knew that I was advising Poland, so he brought me in, and I explained to him, this is what Poland really needs to avoid a hyperinflation. And he said, could you come back in an hour? And so I came back in an hour, and who was there? The National Security Advisor sitting in Senator Dole's office, General Scowcroft. And Senator Dole said, Mr. Sachs, could you explain to General Scowcroft your idea? So I handed him the page. I explained what currency stabilization is, how this was part of Keynes's insight from 1919, and why this was what Poland needed. And General Scowcroft said, well, we'll take a look at it. And Senator Dole said, call me at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, 5 p.m., I called Senator's office and he said, Jeff, tell your friends that they've got their $1 billion. Mm. So that was one day, that was 8 hours. I thought, yeah, pretty damn good economist, that's really persuasive. And I had many other ideas, canceling Poland's debts and so forth. Basically, they were accepted, all of them. I thought, this is pretty good. This is how you're supposed to do stabilization. Poland stabilized, had a stable currency. After the collapse of the Eastern trade, Poland started growth in the middle of 1990 and then had 30 years of growth. Now, the Soviet Union, I should say Yavlinsky, was watching this. So he called, said, could I meet you in Warsaw? And we met, got to know each other a little bit. And I said, I'd be happy to help Gorbachev, whom I admired tremendously, by the way. I know many people do not and see the economic collapse and the collapse of the Soviet Union and all the rest. But Gorbachev was a man of peace and a man of incredible decency. And he wanted a common European home. And I loved the idea, and I got stuck with that idea, I have to say, for the next 33 years, because that's what we really need, not the barriers. So I said I would try to help President Gorbachev. We actually had a project at Harvard and MIT in the spring of 1991 to come up with a plan. I wrote a central part of it based on what Poland had done, which was stabilize its currency, avoid a hyperinflation, get its debts canceled, get a fresh start, begin economic growth. And the White House turned it down flat, immediately. And by the way, I wasn't the only person in this group. This was Graham Allison, who was dean of the Harvard Kennedy School at the time, Robert Blackwell, who became, very major figure in U.S. foreign policy, Stanley Fischer, who became many things, including vice president of the Fed, governor of the Israeli Central Bank, chief economist of the World Bank. It wasn't some bizarre group. It was pretty damn establishment, and we were saying help the Soviet Union avoid a financial collapse. Okay, zero. The White House said, basically ridiculous. We're not going to help the Soviet Union, whether it's Gorbachev or not. Gorbachev fell. Gaidar, who was Yeltsin's economic advisor, called me in the fall, said, please come to the dacha outside of Moscow. We urgently need to talk about the financial situation. So I came in September 89. This is now September 91, and met with Gaidar. And interestingly, just as an example, the G7 finance deputies were coming to Moscow in November. And I know a lot about that. So I said to Yegor Gaidar, who's a wonderful person, tell them you need a standstill on debt payments. You're running out of reserves. Before everything explodes, you need a standstill. So I was with him in the room as the G7 deputies came in. Then he went into the room and I stayed on the outside. The meeting broke and he came out ashen-faced and said, Yegor, what happened? He said, they told me if we don't pay every dollar on time, we stop all aid immediately. The food shipments on the high seas, you pay every penny that's due. And Russia ran out of foreign exchange reserves in the first days of 1992. Now, if you have experience in finance, that means that's how hyperinflation starts. Mm-hmm. I went back to the White House and said, are you kidding? I went to the IMF. Look what Poland did. Nothing. I went to the Secretary of State, who said to me, Mr. Sachs, even if I agree with you, I just want to tell you, it's not going to happen. You're not going to get the aid. I was, of course, nonplussed. Russia was not exactly the enemy at that moment. Russia was at the end of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin said, we're done with this Soviet period. We want to be normal. And what happens in Washington? Absolute, complete unwillingness to do anything, but interestingly, unwillingness to do anything of the kind that they had just done for Poland. It was very confusing to me, frankly, because it was a little bit like a controlled experiment. I was the same economic advisor, it was the same recommendations, it was the same moment a year later. But what I was observing and did not understand at the time was the Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, neocon ascendancy, which was starting. And of course, I didn't realize it was going to become the Biden, Newland, everyone ascendancy. But I was watching something that was completely devoid of economics, completely devoid of just even a scintilla of empathy or understanding that you don't leave a major nuclear power in profound financial crisis, as was happening in 1992. And I was a student of John Maynard Keynes, and especially of what I regard as one of the most important books of the 20th century, The Economics of the Peace, which Keynes wrote in a disgusted mood in 1919 after the Versailles Treaty, saying, are you all crazy? You're creating the conditions for the next World War, for the next horror of Europe by having this kind of punitive settlement. And I was trying to tell them as an expert, don't do this. By the way, I was also advisor to Leonid Kuchma. So this is, people say to me every day now, you're a Putin apologist. This was years before President Putin came on the scene, obviously. And I was advisor to the Ukraine government the same way at the same time. They didn't want to help. This was now the U.S. unipolar world. And it was a little hard for me to understand because I was entranced with the idea of a world of peace, rather naive. Why not? Gorbachev had said, from Rotterdam to Vladivostok, this is a common economic home. This is a world of peace. I thought it was a pretty nice idea. And by the way, it was truly, completely within reach. And we just didn't want it for a moment.
And I would add that the funds that would have been needed would not have been hugely high.
They were tiny. This was the whole thing. Tiny. By the way, $1 billion for Poland. Okay, it was nice to get it in an 8-hour turnaround, but this is nothing. But the effect of it in enabling a currency to be stabilized and enabling a coherent economic program to go forward is enormous. It's not, I won't use the joke of economic stabilization because it'll be misunderstood by people. But I've been involved in many stabilizations. There's a little bit of magic involved in creating a framework of expectations and a little bit of money, well put, well placed at the right moment, goes an enormous distance because it's positively reinforced. And they refuse to do any of that in the case of first Gorbachev's Soviet Union in the last days of perestroika, and then in Yeltsin's new Russia, where Yeltsin said, and I sat across from him, we just want to be normal. We want to be a normal country in a normal time. Please help. I said, Mr. President, no problem. This is the most important development of the 20th century in geopolitics. This is obvious. And it not only was it not obvious, it was completely resisted by the U.S. And I would just add the other thing that, and there's several things that are important to understand how deep the underlying direction is and therefore how persistent it is and how these plans get set and then they get carried out when all the evidence runs the wrong way. You can see all of this forming. I could catch the glimpses of it early on, but then I would really encourage people to read Zbigniew Brzezinski's piece in Foreign Affairs in 1997, I think it's called A Strategy for Eurasia. And he spells out almost precisely the timeline for NATO enlargement, including to Ukraine. This is 1997. Putin's not on the scene. This has nothing to do with Putin. This is no reaction to Putin. This is years, and this is a decade, more than a decade, before the Bucharest NATO summit where the offer is made. And Brzezinski spells out exactly the timeline because these are deep plans. And another thing that people should look at is Wesley Clark, who was the NATO commanding general, because he went into the Pentagon on 2 occasions and came out completely shaken by the neocons who explained to Clark all the wars that the U.S. was going to have to take out all of the governments that had been Soviet or Russian allies, Syria and Iraq and all the rest. This was a plan, long-standing. You don't have to be crazy. Just listen to what these people tell us. The problem is everything else is confidential, hidden, and the government lies nonstop about everything, nonstop. And so you have to be in the room to see it, or you have to know someone who is in the room, or you have to watch very closely to get the drift of this. But, all the people say, oh, it's nothing to do with NATO, blah, 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 blah. They don't know. How could they know? The New York Times has denied it for 20 years in this kind of pablum that the American people have been fed. So they have no data, no information, unless they're watching you guys. That's the basic point. I believe we're in a kind of end stage right now. It's a very dramatic moment. Maybe our mainstream media don't fully appreciate it, but we have some crucial decisions to make just in the next weeks. Here's why.
Ukraine is in terrible trouble. The counteroffensive has failed. The devastation to Ukraine has been immense. It's really been a bloodbath. Ukraine has been worn down terribly by this failed counteroffensive with massive loss of people and a massive loss of hardware. And Russia is probably going to launch a major counteroffensive, and a very dangerous one, very soon. That's not for sure, but I think that is likely. And I think the consequences for everybody, starting with Ukraine and Europe and the world, could be very, very grave if we don't move to negotiation now to save Ukraine first and foremost. Now, my view has been all along that this was a war that could have been avoided at many points, that it is a war caused basically by the U.S. idea of expanding NATO to Ukraine and even to Georgia on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. It's an old U.S. idea. It's even an older British idea because it was basically the British imperial idea of the Crimean War to remove Russian power from the Black Sea. And Brzezinski in the 1990s revived this idea, and our neoconservatives in the United States have tried to put it into place for more than 25 years. So this is a war that has deep roots in U.S. Unilateralism and neoconservatism. This is not how the war is portrayed in our media, which absolutely deny people the history that they need. As everybody knows, I'm sure, in this room, Hans Dietrich Genscher and James Baker were very explicit with President Gorbachev. NATO will not move eastward. The United States cheated. Germany went along with it. And the eastward expansion of NATO started under Clinton, and it accelerated under George Bush with 7 new NATO members in 2004. But the huge, decisive moment was pushing Ukraine's membership in NATO at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008. And we know that Chancellor Merkel was very much against this, as were most of the European leaders. But frankly, European leaders don't stand up to the United States, just like your chancellor today never stands up to the United States, I'm afraid. And so when the U.S. pushed for a commitment for NATO enlargement to Ukraine and Georgia, even though the European leaders knew this was deeply dangerous and misguided, and our own U.S. diplomats knew that this was dangerous and misguided, NATO went ahead with this commitment because the U.S. pressured all the rest of the leaders. And so Ukraine's membership in NATO was promised. This has proved to be devastating for Ukraine. When Yanukovych became president in 2010, he wisely called for neutrality. And neutrality was passed by the Rada, and it became the state law. Then, of course, as you know, the neocons in the United States aimed to overthrow Yanukovych. And however you depict the Maidan revolution of dignity, it was a U.S. regime change operation to a significant extent. This is obvious for anybody that cares to look. Again, our media deny the obvious. It happens that Russia
intercepted a call of Victoria Nuland that explains it all. Because 3 weeks before the violent coup that overthrew Yanukovych, Victoria Nuland was already choosing the new government of Ukraine. So as soon as Yanukovych was overthrown, President Putin retook Crimea so that Sevastopol, the naval base of Russia since 1783, would not fall into NATO hands. And to break away regions of Ukraine, rejected the coup-led government, which was a Russophobic Western Ukrainian government, hostile to Russian ethnic Ukrainians. And these two provinces broke away, Donetsk and Lugansk, and violence broke out. The war started in 2014. And of course, the Minsk agreements were negotiated to stop the war. And Germany and France were the guarantors of the Minsk agreement. But as even Chancellor Merkel told us in interviews last year, nobody took the Minsk agreement seriously in the West. Russia took it seriously, but neither Ukraine, nor Germany, nor the United States, nor France took it seriously. And so the autonomy that was promised for the Donbass was not followed through by the Ukrainian governments. Instead, the United States started to arm a massive army, beginning really with the arms buildup in 2018 and 2019. And this army threatened, as your generals have made clear, to storm the Donbass in 2021 and early 2022. This is the truth. This is not Putin propaganda or Putin apology. This is the US neoconservatives pushing NATO against Russia's red lines and knowing that war would come from this. Even there's a video of Zelensky's senior advisor, Arestovich, in 2019, very clearly saying, we know that pursuing NATO means war with Russia, but we're ready for war with Russia. So we knowingly provoked this war because of this desire to end Russia's great power status by surrounding Russia in the Black Sea region. And the plan all along was that Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia would completely surround Russia and the Black Sea. And this would, in the theory of Brzezinski and going back to the 19th century, make it impossible for Russia to project its power in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. On December 17, 2021, as you know, President Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement to avert the war. And the agreement called for several things, but the most important was an end to NATO enlargement. I personally called the White House after that agreement was put onto the table and really urged President Biden to negotiate. But the U.S. position, and it is the formal NATO position, is that NATO enlargement is none of Russia's business. This is the so-called open door policy, that only NATO and the counterpart, in this case Ukraine, have any say in NATO enlargement, and Russia's interests have no bearing whatsoever. This is sheer reckless arrogance. That's America for you. And this is how we get into wars, because we refused to negotiate over the expansion of NATO. Now, mind you, think of the context in which Russia viewed this. First, the United States had unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002, and the United States was putting missiles into Central and Eastern Europe, starting with Poland and Romania. Russia vociferously objected. The United States said it's none of your business. The U.S., of course, launched wars repeatedly. Serbia, 1999, Afghanistan, 2001, Iraq, 2003, Syria, 2011, Libya, 2011, Ukraine, 2014, with the violent overthrow of Yanukovych. The U.S. refused to negotiate on any of these matters. The U.S. unilaterally built a massive army in Ukraine. This is what Russia saw and faced in early 2022. I'm just explaining this war. I'm not justifying it, I'm explaining it. We walked eyes open into a war. Of course, the United States thought that the sanctions regime, that cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system would bring down the Russian economy. This was stupid, but this was the belief of senior U.S. officials. Senior U.S. officials thought that Putin would not mobilize in Russia, that he would be politically too weak. This was, again, extraordinarily naive, because from Russia's point of view, this question of NATO enlargement is an existential question. It's not just a minor point. It's an existential question. So the United States provoked this war. Putin launched the special military operation. Within 2 weeks, Zelensky called for negotiations based on Ukraine's neutrality. And as you know, at the end of March, there was actually a document about to be signed by Russia and Ukraine based on neutrality, and that would have ended the war. The United States intervened and stopped that agreement. Do you read about it in the mainstream media? No. But this is what happened. And I've spoken to the negotiators, and I flew to Ankara to get a proper briefing about all of this. And I've spoken to many people about this. And the United States blocked this because the United States said to Zelensky, you can defeat Russia. You don't have to accept neutrality, because this project of NATO enlargement was the project of Biden, Nuland, Blinken, and Sullivan. And your government has stood up and cheered all the way, especially your foreign minister, as has much of Europe. It's very sad. Now, what was clear from the beginning is that the sanctions would not crush the Russian economy or prevent Russia from prosecuting this war. It was also clear from the beginning that the so-called wonder weapons of NATO would not be sufficient if Russia chose to fight a war of attrition, because Russia is much larger than Ukraine, because Russia's military-industrial complex is even proportionately larger than Ukraine's. And because for Russia, this was not a small issue where Putin was just going to go away. This was an existential issue. And so again, our generals so frequently do exactly what they've done in Ukraine. All my life, U.S. generals have said victory is just around the corner. They said it in Vietnam. They said it in Iraq. They said it in Libya. They said it in Syria. They said it in Afghanistan. And they said it in Ukraine. Don't worry, everything's under control. But clearly where we are today, nothing is under control. Ukraine has suffered grievously on the battlefield and in the destruction of infrastructure and in the flight of 10 million people or more, and in the annexation of vast territory with many millions more, and with so many dead and wounded each day and week. And the United States just keeps saying, keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting. And you know, our senators have the audacity to say, we're getting our money's worth because no Americans are dying, we're weakening Russia, and we're showing China that we're strong. This is actually what grown-ups in the United States say. It's hideous. How can a senator say such a thing? So profoundly immoral and so profoundly stupid, by the way. Russia's not being weakened by this. Russian military is being strengthened by this. We're not showing China how tough we are. We're depleting our arsenals and showing that Russia can take on the NATO military armaments and hold them at bay. And what does fighting in Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians conceivably have to do with showing China that we're tough? The very idea is appalling. But actually, I'm quoting the senior members of the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee of the U.S. Senate. This is the line that actually the politicians in Washington use, that this is about China. And in the meantime, Ukraine is in desperate shape. Now, let me say that the situation is even more adverse because the awfulness of this is dawning on more and more people. In the elections yesterday, or today, I guess, yesterday or today, because it's time zone difference, in Slovakia, yesterday's election, sorry, a government was just brought to power that ran the campaign on the basis of stopping all support for Ukraine. Poland has announced it's stopping all support for Ukraine. Hungary, of course, has opposed this adventure all along, saying that this was a neocon illusion, not some pro-Ukrainian initiative. So Ukraine is losing its support in Europe one by one. There is not a senior politician in a Western European country that has an approval rating higher than the disapproval rating. Western European politicians are all unpopular. This war is deeply unpopular. The economic boomerang effects are deeply unpopular. What this has done to the German economy is deeply unpopular. And the US blowing up Nord Stream didn't help. So Europe has pulled back. Then, ladies and gentlemen, you probably saw that the United States Congress rejected Biden's call for more financial support for Ukraine in the last-minute maneuvers yesterday that kept the U.S. government functioning with this so-called continuing resolution. That's a kind of stopgap legislation that is passed to keep the government going for another couple of months while the deeper budget debate continues. But President Biden was trying to put in $6 billion of short-term help for Ukraine into that continuing resolution. And it failed In fact, the continuing resolution succeeded only when the money for Ukraine was taken off the table. And this is because the Republican Party in the United States, both in the base of the membership of the party in the United States and increasingly in the leaders of the party in Washington, are opposed to more spending for Ukraine. Now, they have mixed reasons for this. Some is fiscal policy. Some is that they want to spend the money to fight China, not to fight Russia. Some just don't believe in the war. There's a mixed set of motives, but the Republicans do not want to fund this war anymore, and the Republicans control the lower house of our Congress. So that's another reality. So if you add this up, Ukraine having lost in its counteroffensive, losing support in Europe, losing support in the United States, and facing the prospect of a massive offensive by Russia, that's still only a hypothesis, but it's a possible one. What to do? Well, if you are Britain, it's clear. Britain says we should escalate. Britain is sending British military to Ukraine now for on-site training. The British, in my view, are a little crazy, still with the nostalgia for their empire, still fighting the first Crimean War, they think. So I try to put this British view away because it is a nonsense and a danger. What we need to do is not to escalate further, which could end up with the full destruction of Ukraine or an escalation to nuclear war, as we know. We need to understand that all of this all along has fit Clausewitz's famous formulation that war is the continuation of politics with other means. We need to face the politics of this issue. This is a war over NATO enlargement and an internal war between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. And the way that could have kept Ukraine safe and secure would have been neutrality and diversity, a federal structure for Ukraine, recognizing the Russian language and Russian culture, and not having a culture conflict as well as a NATO enlargement. But we've gotten the worst of both worlds, pushing NATO enlargement and a Russophobic Western Ukrainian regime absolutely spewing hate, maybe understandable, but hate against Russia that is totally destructive of peace prospects. So we need to come back to the politics. And in my mind, the politics are roughly the following. I think that there are at least 4 components to a peace agreement. The first and fundamental one is stop NATO enlargement eastward. Stop already. This is so dangerous and provocative. And it's, since Ukraine's not going to join NATO, to keep promising that it will when the war is over means perpetual war or outright defeat of Ukraine. So stop NATO enlargement. Stop this absurdity of this so-called open door policy. Understand that NATO enlargement does concern Russia and that Russia should have a say in this. And that we should remember the promises that Genscher and Kohl and Baker made back in 1990. Anyway, this whole approach has been wrong, driven by U.S. unipolar aspirations. So the first point is stop the NATO enlargement as part of a peace agreement. The second is very difficult now, what to do about the territories. You know, in 2014, Russia wasn't claiming any territories. Then Yanukovych was overthrown, and Russia, it just claimed the Minsk II agreement. But then the Minsk II agreement was repudiated, so Russia claimed the territory of the Donbass. We keep refusing common sense, and the situation keeps getting worse and worse. At this point, there does need to be border change negotiated. And we have to understand that sometimes borders do change. The United States forced a border change of Serbia to put Kosovo out of Serbia. That was a NATO operation, bombing Belgrade for 49 straight days in order to change the border. And the United States did the same with Sudan, siding with the insurgency of South Sudan to change the border. So we're going to have to negotiate borders to reach peace. Crimea certainly is going to remain in Russian hands. The heavily Russian ethnic populations of Ukraine are going to be in Russian hands in the end if we want peace. So that's a second point that I think is obvious. A third point is the United States and Russia need to get back to nuclear arms negotiations. The U.S. never should have abandoned the ABM treaty. The U.S. never should have abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which it did in 2019. Now the New START treaty is in suspension. We need the nuclear negotiations to resume. And the United States has to accept that Russia is right, actually, about this danger of the placement of Aegis missiles without negotiating with Russia. This is destabilizing the nuclear situation. So that's a third plank that is needed. And a fourth plank is to return to the concept of collective security of the OSCE. Because the OSCE is based specifically on the point that no country can choose a military alliance in a way that endangers another country. Unlike the NATO open door doctrine, so-called, that NATO doesn't have to talk to Russia, the whole OSCE is premised on collective security, that no country can take measures that jeopardize a neighboring country. And this is the right point. OSCE is truly Europe's best path for security. I should mention, by the way, that while I was against NATO enlargement all along, I would be very clear, NATO will not retreat from where it is, but it will stop expanding. NATO should not, in these negotiations, leave the Baltic states or leave Romania or Bulgaria or others. No, it can't do that. But it can accept that it will stop the Eastern enlargement. Finally, let me say that while it seems impossible today, I firmly believe that normal relations with Russia should be established between Germany and Russia, and in fact between the European Union and Russia. And by normal relations, I mean trade and finance and tourism and culture. This idea that we are siding to never again speak with Russia or listen to Rachmaninoff or play a Tchaikovsky ballet or have a Russian soprano sing in our opera houses is reprehensible, in my view. What are we doing? We made a terrible political mistake to go deeper and deeper into conflict with Russia rather than operating with respect and actually with consistency. We crossed Russia's red lines knowingly and repeatedly. We overthrew a government in Ukraine. We don't admit any of this, by the way, in the mainstream media. I'm attacked every day for simply repeating the historical truths. So be it. I don't care. These are the truths. And this is the way to peace. We need to understand this is politics, and we need to return to politics. This issue will not be solved. Ukraine will not be saved on the battlefield. Thank you very much.
In light of the United States-India summit held in Washington in June, do you think the meeting between President Joe Biden and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi also highlights a shift in the global balance of power?
A profound and extensive change is taking place in the world. Let's put it this way. The non-Western parts of the world are experiencing rapid economic growth. I'm talking about countries like India, China, certain parts of Africa, and Latin America, which were poor in the past 2 centuries, but are currently showing significant progress in catching up. If you consider the European Union with a population of around 450 million and the United States with 335 million inhabitants, it accounts for only 10% of the world's population. So the majority of the world, which is still relatively poor, but reducing the gap, lies outside of this.
Seeing this, do you think the United States and the West can accept that there is a certain shift towards developing countries? In fact, it's not just towards developing countries, but towards economic powers such as China or India. Will the West accept that it no longer exclusively wields global influence?
I believe that Europe roughly understands this, although ideas about a European empire still arise occasionally, but these are mostly remnants of the past. In the United States, there is a very strong financial and ideological entity known as the military-industrial complex, which currently does not accept this viewpoint. In my opinion, it represents a significant destabilizing factor in the world. This entity still wants the United States to be dominant over Russia and China. They think that the United States will create an anti-China alliance with India, but this is a very naive and unrealistic notion. I think the majority of the American people are not concerned about whether the United States is the first, second, or fifth largest power in the world because we have so many problems at home. The American people would be completely happy if their government focused on the problems that have accumulated domestically. However, the mentioned military-industrial complex is a strong and dominant player in American foreign policy, which still imagines that the United States is the leading superpower. Furthermore, many European countries, at least currently, subscribe to this idea because many European leaders confuse the European Union with NATO and unfortunately equate them, which is a regrettable mistake. So my answer is that a good and peaceful transition to a truly multipolar world is possible, but there are those who oppose it in the United States.
You mentioned the defense industry, which is a huge economic sector and a source of revenue and profit for the industries involved. This brings us immediately to the issue of the war in Ukraine, in which Russia is the aggressor. Yet the question arises, who benefits from peace and ending this bloody war?
This war broke out because the United States insisted on NATO expanding eastward and pushed for this to happen in Ukraine and Georgia as well. However, Ukraine and Georgia are red lines that cannot be crossed for Russia. Don't do it, the Russians said. The United States, however, was so dismissive, despite the fact that for 3 decades, Russia has been saying, don't dare bring your missiles, bases, and armies to Ukraine, that America thought they were just bluffing. What could Russia do, as it is so weak, and we can do whatever we want? However, President Putin called their bluff. The United States still insists on NATO's presence in Ukraine, and even NATO leaders say they will, of course, expand the organization to Ukraine. Most European leaders, with the exception of Prime Minister Orban, say that NATO will naturally expand to Ukraine. But this is the recipe for endless war and crisis. Thus, the Russian-Ukrainian war was provoked by American aspirations for hegemony. And if we had left Russia alone, had not confronted it with the possibility of NATO expansion in Ukraine, this war would never have broken out.
At the same time, Washington argues that Western military support only serves to assist Ukraine in protecting its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The United States claims to support Ukraine as long as necessary. But where are the hopes for a peace agreement?
There could have been peace in December 2021 when President Putin put a draft agreement on the table with the United States, which was based on Ukraine's neutrality. But Washington rejected it. There could have been peace in April 2022 when Russia and Ukraine negotiated an agreement based on Ukraine's neutrality. The United States rejected that too. The day when the President of the United States, Joe Biden, came out in public and said that Russia must call home its army and the United States will never allow NATO to expand to Ukraine. This could have been the basis for ending the war. But Biden is unwilling to say this because he disagrees. He has been among those who support NATO expansion for 30 years, as does his environment, as do the top brass of the American military, the generals. They do not want peace. They want continuing war until the United States achieves its goal.
I attended a press conference led by John Kirby, the spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, who argued that the Biden administration's approach to foreign policy is one of cooperation. Over the past 2 years, however, we have seen unprecedented political and economic division develop globally. This raises the question, how effective is this cooperative foreign policy, and how successful is it?
In this sense, Biden is a neoconservative, having been part of the aforementioned military-industrial complex throughout his congressional career as vice president and now as president. He doesn't support collaboration with others whom he calls allies and friends. He says that the greatest challenge and basis for division in the world today is the divide between democracies and autocracies. However, this is nonsense. And it's dangerous because the world is not structured that way, and it should not be so bifurcated. The world should be unified in order to face common challenges, whether it's in regards to the functioning of the world economy, the preservation of the natural environment, or the ever-increasing uncertainty. And yet we don't do this, but instead try to expand NATO, increase military budgets, and speak aggressively about China. After Secretary of State Blinken's seemingly reasonable and constructive visit to Beijing, the next day, President Biden restarted and called President Xi Jinping a dictator. One wonders what kind of China policy this is. The world does not want this kind of destabilization. It does not need this foreign policy. The United States must contribute to ending the war in Ukraine, understanding that Russia also has legitimate security interests. These must be negotiated also to protect Ukraine and ensure that the security interests of every country are upheld.